Do you guys know the meme that's like, guy who has only seen the Boss Baby watching a second movie? Getting a lot of Boss Baby vibes from this. That is me with Steven Universe. Everything I watch, do, and think about in some way, shape, or form traces back to Steven Universe, which is why I'm still talking about the show 5 years after it ended. Going on 6. Love that. One of the many things the show is dearly remembered for is its lasting impact on LGBT representation within Western animation. Before Steven Universe, it was pretty dry out here. The most representation we got were homophobic gags, queer-coded Disney villains, and 2 girls holding hands and staring into each other's eyes. Gay representation was more like a feeling, one you only got if you were really gay, wrote fanfiction, and or grew up on Tumblr. But Steven Universe paved the way for LGBT representation to flourish in the coming years, with shows like She-Ra, Adventure Time, The Owl House, Kipo, and Dead End Paranormal Park. Nowadays, queer relationships can be a central part of a show instead of a footnote or shoved into the background. And this transformation in media all traces back to a rock with attachment issues crying over a millennia-long situationship. Let me back up before y'all click off the video. Steven Universe was created by Rebecca Sugar, who reflected a lot of their experience as a bi and non-binary person onto the show. The show is centered on the Gems, a race of female-coded warriors who have near-exclusively sapphic relationships within the show, such as Ruby and Sapphire, Pearl and Rose, and later Pearl and Bismuth. Then there's fusion, or the act of 2 gems combining into one, which is a beautiful metaphor for intimate relationships and queerness in and of itself. There are also non-binary characters such as Shep, Stevani, all of Steven's fusions with the gems, and technically every single gem. And need I remind you that Steven Universe had the first same-sex wedding and proposal in a kid show? A wedding so powerful that Sugar had to fight her butt off to keep it in the show. A scene so wholesomely gay that it led to the show being pulled from global markets and ultimately its premature cancellation. Hell is hot for studio executives. I'm looking at you too, Disney. Suffice to say, Steven Universe is seen as groundbreaking in terms of LGBT representation. But there's one queer element of the show that I have not seen discussed at length, and that's the trans essence embedded in the core of the series. Now that's not to say that people have not discussed the trans narrative of the show. I have seen it discussed in a few places like Twitter, Reddit, and a handful of articles. But I find they tend to focus on the finale and the allegory of Steven proving he is not Pink Diamond. And while I will discuss this, I do not think the trans narrative starts nor ends with that allegory. This is why I refer to it nebulously as an essence, because I see it as fundamental to every aspect of the series. So what do I mean by trans essence? I'm not talking about the overt non-binary representation, and no, I'm not saying that Steven is trans, but if I was, I hope you put the keyboard away and keep on listening. I'm talking about the parts embedded in the very foundation of the series, the social constructs within Homeworld that mirror our own, the queer metaphors that often have both a diegetic and non-diegetic meaning, the themes of self-love, identity, and embracing who you are in spite of the circumstance. I find that these elements, and the narrative it paints, so powerfully validate and affirm trans identity. All the while, there's not a single explicitly trans person in the show. Sorry, Shep, but that's for the future. Steven Universe, future, get it? Furthermore, I think this essence is only possible because the show was made by a queer creator who both consciously and unconsciously put their own perspective of the world into the show. Whether or not you choose to read Steven Universe through a trans lens, that influence is ever present and makes Steven Universe a really unique piece of media. To some, this trans essence may be obvious, and I'm definitely not the first to notice it. But I'm hoping to unpack its complexity, and in doing so, reveal something new for you. I find there are pieces of it that are obvious, and other parts that only come with an explicitly trans reading of the material. But above all, what I find most unique about this series is that while other shows tend to discuss the trans experience from an ally or outsider perspective, Steven Universe gets us to consider it from a trans person's perspective without us even realizing it. So how does Sugar achieve this? What are these complexities and nuances I'm talking about? Is Steven Universe just queer theory for children? And why the hell am I this passionate about fictional rocks in space? You're about to find out. My name is Angel Manson, my pronouns are they, them, and this is Infodump. Now, before I can talk about the allegorical parts of the narrative, I want to talk about the more explicit representations of queerness. This will also help us get a good understanding of how queerness operates in the show as a whole. Mind you, I'm going to be recapping bits and pieces of the series, so if you're a fan of the show, bear with me and we'll get to the good stuff later. But if you've only seen a bit of Steven and don't know what's in his universe, you might get a little lost and will definitely be spoiled, so please watch accordingly. As you may know, the Crystal Gems are a group of rebels who fought against the tyranny and ideology of their home planet, Homeworld, all in the name of the planet Earth. On Homeworld, gems are made to serve a specific purpose: pearls as servants, quartzes as soldiers, rubies as guards, diamonds as rulers. But the Crystal Gems rebel against this very idea. Instead, they believe in freedom, bodily autonomy, and becoming more than their assigned function. On Earth, a pearl is allowed to be a warrior, an overcooked amethyst is still a valuable member of the team, and a fusion between a ruby and a sapphire is celebrated. Back on Homeworld, each and every one of them would have been punished for rebelling against the social norm and simply existing as themselves. Their cause was started by Rose Quartz, and though her true motives weren't necessarily altruistic, she still very much believed in the idea of freedom and autonomy. She found freedom in an entirely new identity, taking on the form of Rose Quartz to leave behind her life as Pink Diamond. In a way, she in and of herself is a symbol of queerness, and even transness. No, Patrick, I am not saying that Rose Quartz is trans. But there's definitely something genderfucky happening here, right? Though she does not change her gender, she undergoes a massive, dramatic change in physical and social identity. It's not enough for her to live on Earth as Pink Diamond. She has to literally kill Pink Diamond and become someone new. Yes, she did it as part of a larger plot, but that metaphor is still really powerful in the context of transness. Some trans people resent the idea of your pre-transition self being dead, especially since it's often a transphobic talking point. A mom may say her trans daughter killed her son. Meanwhile, some trans people may embrace or find power in the metaphor. But regardless of how someone may feel about the term, that idea of killing your old self is present in the cultural psyche. It can even be connoted from the term dead naming. I choose to read this idea through a trans-positive lens. The idea that you wield so much power over your identity that you can choose whether to kill it, or embrace it, or totally transform it. Pink Diamond becoming Rose Quartz, leaving her past a secret known only to Pearl, all so she could live in this totally new identity unburdened by her old self, is very trans. And this isn't even getting into the idea of Rose becoming Steven. I actually won't spend much time on that idea in this essay, though there is an obvious trans metaphor in Rose becoming a boy. But part of the power of the trans narrative I'll unpack is that Steven is literally not Rose. She's gone.
She's gone!
And I don't want to undermine that powerful narrative with the idea that Rose turned into or transitioned into Steven. I think there are much stronger points to emphasize beyond that literal change in gender. But I can't deny that there is something interesting happening there, and it's all a part of this trans essence that the show is seeping with at every turn. And some of that essence is found in the gender identity of the gems themselves. As I said earlier, the gems are canonically all non-binary women, much like Sugar's own gender-fluid identity. In an NPR 1A interview, they said, "One of the things that's really important to me about the show is that the gems are all non-binary women. They're very specific, and they're coming from a world where they don't really have the frame of reference. They wouldn't think of themselves as women, but they're fine being interpreted that way amongst humans." And it makes sense. On Homeworld, there aren't really any genders as we know them. A gem is defined solely by their gemstone and species, not by man or woman. But since the gems take on forms that resemble human women, on Earth they are perceived as women. In some ways, they embrace this identity and even experiment with femininity, but they would not strictly define themselves by it. For the non-binary folk out there, this is a whole mood. Furthermore, all of Steven's fusions are queer in some way. Except Stag, I guess, but look at that man and tell me he's cis-hetero. You can't. But the rest of Steven's fusions are canonically genderqueer. Smoky Quartz is they/them, Rainbow 2.0 is he/they, Sunstone is he/they, and Stevani is intersex and uses they/them pronouns. It's also worth noting that Steven is shown to be gender non-conforming throughout the show. This doesn't mean that he identifies as non-binary or even queer. As far as we know, he is a cis, straight character, but he is perfectly comfortable expressing his femininity, such as wearing pink, being empathetic and nurturing, and expressing his emotions freely, often through crying. He uses feminine powers, such as healing and wielding a rose emblazoned shield. and he cross-dresses twice in the series, once in Sadie's song, and again when he gets to Homeworld. And unlike male characters in other shows, Steven shows no level of shame or discomfort wearing a dress. In fact, it's never commented on at all by any character, and simply exists within the show. This positive representation of masculinity is really powerful in and of itself, but I don't spend much time on it, so I recommend you watch Pop Culture Detective's video on the topic after this one. So as you can see, we already have this strong connection between gems and gender queerness. And we see this idea explored even further when we take a closer look at fusion. Fusion is also a huge source of queerness within the show. Back on Homeworld, there's a set of norms and expectations regarding who can and can't fuse. Only 2 or more gems of the same species can fuse. So 5 rubies can fuse, or 2 topazes can fuse, but a ruby and a topaz can never fuse. The crystal gems, however, fuse regardless of this rule. Despite them being all different types of gems, they fuse openly, and even see it as a source of strength and pride. Not only is this queer in the sense of defying a social norm, but in the way it completely undermines Homeworld's entire way of thinking. Homeworld is about structure, order, and organization. Gems have a name, a purpose, and are neatly placed along an existing hierarchy, but cross-gem fusion completely disrupts that structure. We see this in the scene when Blue Diamond finds out about Garnet's name.
Whoa, are you talking about Garnet?
Garnet? Does that call herself a Garnet? What would you have her do? Enter with the Demantoids, the Hessenites, the Pyropes?
The implication is that Garnet is not easily categorized. Ruby and Sapphire's fusions create something that may resemble other Garnet gems, but Garnet is a chosen label. The scene where Smoky Quartz names themselves also contributes to this theory.
Who are you supposed to be?
Oh yeah, who am I now? I feel like Amethyst knows this. I think a rose quartz and an amethyst make Smoky Quartz.
When I first watched this scene, I thought Smokey was literally doing gemstone math, as if there was a concrete answer to what a rose quartz and an amethyst make. But this scene, coupled with Blue Diamond's comment on Garnet, leads me to believe there is no concrete answer for this equation. Rather, Smokey is simply thinking of a gem that approximates their identity and choosing that label. This leads us to the real reason that Homeworld does not allow this type of fusion. It makes something unpredictable, unexpected, and uncategorizable, all things that are in opposition to the hierarchy of Homeworld. Categorization is required for hierarchy, an us versus a them, a have versus a have-not. If there are no labels and no order, then nobody can be on top. So Garnet defining herself as an experience is radical and antithetical to everything that Homeworld is. So here, we're starting to see the multi-layered queerness that makes Steven Universe really fascinating to me. Garnet is queer both diegetically and non-diegetically. That is, in the world of Steven Universe and outside of the context of that world. In text, she's a cross-gem fusion that does not fall into Homeworld social norms. And out of text, we perceive Ruby and Sapphire as a lesbian relationship. Even though within the world of Steven Universe, they're technically not gay. They're literally rocks. And still, there's a layer of subtext revealed when you analyze the hierarchy within Homeworld. Garnet exists completely outside of the comprehension of Gem Society, and is not allowed to exist because she cannot be classified under their system. And there is nothing more queer than that. This idea of a character being so queer that they cannot be defined is a core part of the trans narrative I'm piecing together here. And there is no better case study for this than Steven himself. But to understand how Steven exists outside of Homeworld's constructs, we have to define what those constructs are. Now we're really gonna get into the meat and potatoes about why I find Steven Universe's world building so fascinating. Rebecca Sugar somehow created a fantasy world with social constructs that mirror and reveal bias within our own concept of gender without ever directly discussing gender itself. We simply observe the natural consequences of those constructs, and it's up to us to decide how to interpret them. You could do so through a different lens, such as race, or disability, or feminism. And mind you, all those readings would be perfectly valid and are not mutually exclusive from the topics I'll be discussing. But through a trans reading, I feel the core of the series comes to life, and it reveals a rich network of metaphor and subtext that enhances the story. My goal is not to argue that this is the main interpretation of Steven Universe, but rather to reveal the unique ways that the show facilitates this interpretation. Y'all, I'm about to get my PhD when I'm done with this one. The biggest social construct within Homeworld is how gemstones are perceived. The parts that make up a human body, our face, our hair, our limbs, are not actually the core of a gem's body. The majority of a gem's body is nothing more than a tangible illusion, a projection of solid light emitted from a gemstone, obviously. To gems, their body is more like their gender presentation. They're malleable features that are policed by Homeworld, but they don't make up a gem's core anatomy. Rather, the most important aspect of a gem's anatomy is their gemstone. Not only is it the makeup of their physical body, if a gemstone is shattered, the gem is killed, but gems are also socially categorized based on that gemstone. Much like sex in our world, a person's gemstone determines how they are expected to look and behave. Though most gems can shapeshift, Homeworld gems are meant to look either identical or similar to one another and are expected to only appear in their default form. To not look or act the way you should is to be defective or off color, which either leads to your shattering or your exile to the margins of society. People often look at Steven, who appears to have a rose quartz gem, and assume that he is choosing an incorrect form. Multiple times, gems are disgusted by his presentation.
Rose, why do you look like that? Why are you so weak?
Where is the accused?
Is that rose quartz? Look at this hideous form she's taken. Forget the trial. We should shatter her just for looking like that.
Now, sex and gender are not perfect terms to describe a gemstone and body. Firstly, you could just as easily view a gemstone as an indicator of race. And secondly, while the human body is made up of much more than just sex characteristics, the gemstone acts as a gem's brain, heart, and arguably soul. So I hope it's obvious that I don't mean to imply the same is true for people. I'm just using familiar language to describe fantastical elements of the show. With this in mind, for the purpose of this analysis, I'll be thinking of the gemstone as sex and the projected body as gender presentation. Using this framework, Homeworld is a fantastic metaphor for a society superimposing its norms and biases onto your body. To rebel against Homeworld is not just to deny their ideology, but to deny their say in what you do with your body. I find this metaphor so successful because it is so foreign to us, the audience. The part of a gem we most identify with is their projected body, and this is purposeful. We don't find out the core of a gem is their gemstone until 16 episodes into the show. And we don't see anybody refer to Steven as rose quartz until 51 episodes in. We are conditioned, both by our own norms and by the show itself, to see the gems as more than their gemstone. So when we are introduced to Homeworld's ideology of viewing the gemstone as the body, it comes as a surprise. It's portrayed as demoralizing, is literally objectifying, and deprives our main characters of their personhood.
This is all that's left of her army? Some lost, defective pearl? A puny, overcooked runt? And this shameless display?
This is only exacerbated when it happens to Steven, whose identity the entire show is framed around. We understand Steven as himself, but Homeworld gens repeatedly struggle to comprehend his identity.
What is that?
It calls itself the Steven.
Please, call me Steven.
Pink Steven.
No, just Steven.
Just Steven.
Even after the Diamonds learn of Steven's true identity, and Steven explains that he is not Pink Diamond anymore, they continue to call him Pink.
Oh, Pink, you always did have quite a knack for making me laugh.
You actually said my name.
Steven? Steven? It's such a funny sounding name. You're so creative, Pink.
Misgender him?
Make sure you go over all of our customs with Pink, since she has so much trouble recalling her past here on Homeworld.
And expect him to look and act like Pink.
Are you really going to look like this? Even at the ball?
I can't really help it.
Pink, are you going to ring in the ball?
What?
Oh, I'll take care of it. I'll take care of everything.
Not only is Steven compared to his mother and incorrectly believed to be an extension of her, but he finds that he gains more power and respect the more he acts like her. This is an on-the-nose parallel to what trans people often experience: being dead-named, misgendered, and choosing at times to conform to social norms in order to navigate society. But what makes Steven Universe unique is that in these moments, Steven is not portrayed as other. Rather, Steven's identity is what feels familiar to the audience, while Homeworld's social constructs feel alien. We've had to learn Homeworld's norms piece by piece over several seasons: how gems are made for a function, categorized by their stone, and expected to look and behave a certain way. We have to figure out why Homeworld cannot comprehend Steven as himself. This allows us as the audience to experience social norms from a trans perspective, a world in which the body is objectified, categorized, and mapped onto an imbalanced hierarchy. It can take a lot of time and work to unlearn the lens through which we're taught to view our bodies, even for queer people. But in Steven Universe, where the gemstone is portrayed as a body, it's near effortless. By presenting the gemstone as a body, Sugar asks audiences to consider the absurdity of attaching social constructs to our own. Specifically, she gets the audience to see gender as a construct, how it's designed, and its harms, without ever discussing gender in text. Through this lens, we see Steven's true identity as innate, and his assigned identity of Pink Diamond as absurd. Thus, we see the world of Steven Universe through a trans perspective, where gender is constructed, norms are artificial, and identity is malleable. And this lens makes it even more powerful when we begin to see the construct as fallible. We actually see Homeworld's social constructs begin to fall apart much earlier than Change Your Mind. Pink Diamond herself proves that Homeworld's social constructs are malleable. Simply by manipulating her gemstone, she changes how she is perceived in society. She instantly goes from a powerful ruler to an everyday soldier. This may seem arbitrary, but within the rules of Homeworld, a gemstone is an unchangeable characteristic that places you along a rigid hierarchy. The fact that turning the orientation of a gem is enough to move you along that hierarchy is pretty wild. Rose Quartz is not beating the trans allegations anytime soon, I'm just saying. Later, Steven presents that same idea in reverse. After revealing his aura to yellow and blue, he is simply accepted as Pink Diamond, despite the fact that his gem still appears to be a rose quartz. He is taken from the very bottom of Gem Society, a rebel crystal gem, to the very top, a diamond, instantaneously. Homeworld's hierarchy failed. It miscategorized Pink Diamond's gem twice. To put it frankly, Pink put on a shake-and-go wig and passed so well that no one was able to clock her for 6,014 years. The social construct is made of wet cardboard. But obviously, this is just a drop in the water compared to the events of Change Your Mind. To challenge the flaws of Homeworld's status quo, Steven Universe shows us what happens when we take Gem Society to its logical extreme. If gems merely exist to fulfill a purpose, then the perfect gem would be completely devoid of identity, simply existing to play their role in the hierarchy. White Diamond is this. She's cold, calculated, and at first doesn't even seem to experience emotion. She simply plays her role as the matriarch of Gem Society. If Steven is the joy of embracing your identity, White Diamond is the absence of any identity. She upholds harmful social norms to such an extreme degree that it deprives her of a sense of self. She sees herself as everyone, and everyone as her.
After all, I'm every color of the light. But you're a part of me, the part I always have to repress. Now they are brilliant. Now they are perfect. Now they are me.
She's not a person, she's a concept. And this is where the trans narrative of Steven Universe really comes together for me. White Diamond is completely and utterly convinced that Steven isn't himself. Rather, she sees him as Pink Diamond, who has tricked herself into believing that she's someone else. Here, White parodies the transphobic talking point that a trans person is merely confused or deluded about their identity.
You became Rose Quartz to deceive your pathetic friends, and now you've improved on that because you're even deceiving yourself.
It's very fitting then that the way Steven defeats her is not by overpowering her or redeeming her, but by shattering her worldview, and therefore her sense of self. When she removes Steven's gem, she thinks she is literally removing Pink Diamond out of Steven's body because she only sees gems as their gemstone. She ignores their projected form, and in this case, ignores Steven's humanity. But when Steven's gem reforms, it's not as Pink Diamond or Rose Quartz, but as another form of Steven. There is nothing and no one inside Steven's gem but himself. White even tries to control this half of Steven, attempting to use her powers to take control of him. The implication being that, if she could, she would force Steven to play the role of Pink Diamond, even if he did not look or act like her.
I only want you to be yourself. If you can't do that, I'll do it for you!
She is desperate to have Steven play his role in Gem Society, even if it means depriving him of his identity and shoving him into a box in which he obviously does not fit. She'd rather have a hollow imitation of Pink Diamond than to admit that Steven exists at all. But ultimately, this fails. And in a beautiful scene, Steven fuses back with his gem half, and finally proves to White Diamond that he is himself, and it breaks her. In the end, Steven causes White Diamond to embarrass herself and blush a bright pink hue, causing her to break one of Homeworld's social norms, that gems should always look as themselves. Though she has tried to suppress it for millennia, she too is an off-color gem that cannot fit the mold of society. White Diamond believed in this hierarchy, and believed herself to be at the top, the ideal gem without imperfections. The system had to function to validate her self-worth and identity, because that system was her identity. So when she finds out she has a flaw, she realizes that the system is flawed. And all at once, her identity and the social norms she upheld for millennia are shattered.
What's happening? What is this? What's wrong with them? They're turning pink. I don't understand. I'm in control. Something's wrong with me! No!
I think fandom has a hard time wrapping its mind around different interpretations of a piece of media. Often, when someone offers a different reading of a show, especially a trans reading, fans of the show flock to tell them why they're actually wrong. But that defeats the point of a reading. A reading basically asks, what can we learn, or how can we benefit from looking at a text through this specific lens? And I think by looking at Steven Universe through a trans lens, we learn a lot. Through this lens, we follow the story of a young boy who was burdened by questions surrounding his identity. These questions aren't internal. Steven has always been himself and loved every moment of it. But when confronted with another society's view of him, he is forced to question and even compromise his identity. Who is Steven? Is he a fusion? A shapeshifter? An experience? Or is his identity actually a lie? Ultimately, the show says that Steven is Steven. He defies everything that everyone has ever known about him and surprises even the audience up until the very last moment. His identity is so unique that it causes White to question her own, and his love for himself is so powerful that it's enough to take down an empire. Even beyond Steven, we see a trans essence all throughout Steven Universe. We see it in the gender identity of the gems, the lens through which we view Homeworld, and the questions the show poses by asking us to consider the gemstone as a body. How do you navigate a world that categorizes you based on your body alone? Is it possible to be an individual if you were made for a purpose? What does it mean to embrace every part of yourself? It creates an effortless metaphor for transness without even mentioning gender. Much like Steven, trans people are not allowed to exist within our society because they disrupt the harmful systems that keep certain people in power. The very existence of trans people challenges cis heteronormativity. Transness tells people that they can break out of their categories and choose to redefine themselves. Transness makes people introspective, creative, rebellious, free-spirited, and self-loving, all things antithetical to a rigid hierarchy. I think unfortunately, a lot of people's identities are like that of White Diamond's, defined by the society they live in. Not because the system is good, but because they have never had the time, desire, or courage to explore themselves. This leads them to feel fear, anger, and jealousy at people who do explore their identity freely because they think, how can you exist outside the system? The mere existence of trans people forces people to interrogate the system they grew up in and consequently question their own identity. And that's what we see with White Diamond. The battle against Steven wasn't just an attempt to force Steven to suppress his identity, but a fight to preserve her own.
This can't be happening. I can't have a flaw. I'm supposed to be flawless. If I'm not perfect, then who am I? If you're not pink, then who are you? Who is anyone?
Once Steven proves he is himself, Homeworld's hierarchy finally breaks in a way that is irreparable. Before, flaws could be ascribed to defective and off-color gems who weren't following their roles. But in this moment, everything points back to White, and therefore back to the system. She is forced to grapple with the fact that the system is inherently wrong, because the system cannot account for Steven. I'll end on this quote from Rebecca Sugar that I think perfectly encapsulates my thoughts, and is what inspired me to finish this essay. If White Diamond is everyone, and everyone is her, then her wrongness about him is a wrongness about herself and everyone and everything. Ultimately, her identity is so fragile, and she's so poorly differentiated, that Steven is able to defeat her by existing. Thanks for watching. If you have made it through this whole video, thank you so much, and please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and checking out some of my other videos. I am a baby channel, so literally any form of support is so helpful to me. Thank you so much.
Garnet, help me out here.
Stevoni, listen to me. You are not two people, and you are not one person. You are an experience. Make sure you're a good experience. Now, go have fun!
Corny.